Welcome to Novara Live on another day where we get to see a man bejeweled in millions of pounds worth of diamonds explain how we're going to solve the cost of living crisis. I'm joined by Helena, aka No Justice MTG. Do you watch these things live? You sort of there glued to the screen as you see the black rod and the king with his jeweled crown?
We did watch the debate live on stream earlier today, and you know what? It was just as boring as I expected in some places, but very much more interesting in other places.
Yeah, you said the debate potentially boring. This show will not be. We're going to talk about Labour's legislative agenda. There is a fair amount of interesting stuff in there. That will take up most of the show. Towards the end, though, we will discuss another story, which is the really horrific killing of a disabled man in Gaza and how the BBC covered his story in a really quite appalling way. You won't believe the headline they used for it. The King's speech is a very odd affair. It's read by the King, but written by the democratically elected government, and to any outsider, the pomp and costumes all look pretty bizarre. This time around, it was also slightly more interesting than usual, because for the first time in 15 years, the King, or I suppose it was the Queen before, the monarch, was outlining the legislative agenda for a Labour government.
My Lords and members of the House of Commons, my government will govern in service to the country. My government's legislative programme will be mission-led and based upon the principles of security, fairness and opportunity for all. Stability will be the cornerstone of my government's economic policy, and every decision will be consistent with its fiscal rules. It will legislate to ensure that all significant tax and spending changes are subject to an independent assessment by the Office for Budget Responsibility.
It's incredibly soporific, isn't it, listening to this very posh voice talk about fiscal responsibility. Rachel Reeves, of course, delighted there as she watched the King read out her cast iron commitments to fiscal responsibility. Once those were out of the way, though, the key theme running through the 12-minute address was about how the new government would get Britain growing.
Securing economic growth will be a fundamental mission. My government will seek a new partnership with both business and working people and help the country move on from the recent cost of living challenges by prioritizing wealth creation for all communities. My ministers will establish an Industrial Strategy Council. It is my government's objective to see rising living standards in all nations and regions in the United Kingdom. My ministers will get Britain building, including through planning reform, as they seek to accelerate the delivery of high-quality infrastructure and housing.
So as you could probably tell from that short clip, the King's speech, it's not intended really to go into any detail about any of the policy issues or the legislation that Labour intends to pass. It's instead more of a statement of intent. So it lists all the bills the government hopes to pass over the course of a parliamentary session. Our parliamentary session usually lasts around a year. So this is what Labour are planning to do over the next 12 months. So what are those bills that Labour are planning? Well, there's a full 40 of them which have been announced, and they range from the very technical, so there's the product safety and metrology bill, apparently metrology means measurement, to the totemic, such as bringing the railways back into public ownership. But let's start with a theme that led two of the papers this morning. The Daily Mail quotes Starmer as saying the only debate will be how, not if, we build, and the Times went with the more straightforward, locals will lose right to block new homes. The Times explain how this will work. So they say new legal measures will force councils to quickly identify enough land to meet their predicted future housing need. Once that land has been identified, there will be a presumption in favour of development, with local residents able to agree the style of new housing but not object to it getting built. Councils that fail to produce timely plans will see ministers step in and impose house building blueprints on them. Now, there's lots of I suppose the problems with Labour's housing policy tends to be what's not there. What's not there is the state getting really involved in building loads of council homes. That's what I'd love to see. This on its own, other things being equal though, I am in favour of, right? I think it's good to say the planning system should be about how we build stuff, the kind of things we build, and not whether to build it altogether. Because the problem we have in this country, or one of the many problems we have, is that if you are, in a small local community or a large local community, you say, well, we don't really need more people to live here. No, our lives are okay. Why would we want someone from another part of the country to move here? We've got our homes, which we own. We've got our views. So yeah, we're all in favour of building houses, but maybe do it somewhere else. So I think it's good that Labour are saying we will reintroduce targets that local authorities have to meet. And if they say, we don't want to build this here, you say, okay, well then you've got to build something there, in your same local authority. So this does seem to be a start in terms of getting more homes built. Although, as we always say on Novara Media, it would be better if there was also a big push to build a bunch of council homes and social homes, because leaving it to private developers, even if you can make the planning system slightly simpler, which I think should increase the housing supply to some degree, they're still, it's difficult to rely on them, because the moment house prices start to fall, they get a little bit tetchy and they say, well, maybe we'll sit on this land for a bit more until house prices go up again, which isn't great if, like me, you actually want house prices to fall. The most totemic issue, of course, when it comes to planning is the green belt. So those are the big strips of land that surround Britain's major cities where no one is allowed to build. It's supposed to prevent sort of endless sprawl. And that theme came up this morning in an interview between the BBC's Nick Robinson and Labour's Pat McFadden.
There's talk of redesignating parts of the green belt to be grey belt, areas that can have development. Is the message quite simple? If and when that happens, you can't say not in my backyard. You might say, I'd rather the roofs look different. You might say, I'd rather there were 100 houses rather than 150. But houses will be built in those areas because the government decides they will.
Well, this discussion always starts with the green belt. It shouldn't start with the green belt. It should start with brownfield. I represent Wolverhampton South East. In a city like Wolverhampton, we have lots of brownfield sites, sometimes with derelict factories on them that have been lying there not for years, but for decades. So we start with brownfield. This is not a policy to immediately leap to the green belt and say that's where all the new housing is going to be.
But it is an option.
There are parts of the green belt which we've called grey belt, which when people hear the term green belt, they might think it's all England's green and pleasant land. And look, we are not. We care about the countryside. We care about how beautiful this country is. We want to preserve that. But there are parts of what is called green belt that aren't really very green at all. We've called them grey belt. We think they can be built on. And that's something, again, that in the planning changes that we're going to make, will make it more easy to do.
You see, something you're trying to have it both ways, that you talk boldly and then as individual Labour MPs, now ministers, you oppose development. Who said, for example, the city should not have to be forced between the housing we need and the green space we love?
That is a quote I do recognise, and I'm sure you'll have a lot of fun with these things.
Pat McFadden, August 2019, opposing the development of building hundreds of houses, on what's called 7 cornfields near Wolverhampton.
And I'll tell you what's near the 7 cornfields. Lots of brownfield sites where the housing could have gone. And that's why when I say brownfield first, it is exactly what we'll do.
So I'm going to be controversial here. And I actually think, if you watch this regularly, you'll probably know this. I think we can build on a bunch of green fields, right? Because England has so many green fields. I think it's really important that there's sort of countryside that people can visit. I'm actually more interested in sort of there being green fields, right next to or bang in the middle of cities. I live near the Hackney Marshes. I love walking my dog there. I would be really upset if that were built over. But we do have, endless streams and streams of green fields, which no one really visits, right? Because they're not beautiful. They're just a bit of farmland, right? And I would say housing more important than sort of an extra 1% of farmland. So I'm very much in favour of building on the green belt in the right way. Right, I want beautiful houses. I don't think leaving it all to Taylor Wimpey and saying you can build wherever you want is necessarily going to give us great outcomes. But I'm not as fussed about the green belt as as many voters. I mean, that's why Pat McFadden obviously has to sort of give it this new name, which is the Grey Belt, because he knows that actually, while I might be somewhat relaxed about building on fields, many people aren't. The other thing that came up there, and this will be a sort of long-term talking point, I think, is that you've got many people now in government who are saying, we want to make it easier to build, when they were, well, they still are, of course, but when it came to something being built in their constituency, were slightly less keen because they then had their local residents sort of nagging them. It goes without saying, opposing house building and other key infrastructure in one's own constituency is a very much cross-party affair. After Labour ended the ban on onshore wind and approved new wind farms, Tory MP Alicia Kearns was up in arms when one of those was in her constituency. She explained her opposition to BBC East Midlands.
I absolutely plan to fight it. We're all devastated, if I'm honest, and that's what I've been hearing today from people. But we're also really at a loss as to how the Secretary of State claims that he could have properly reviewed the Mallard proposal in essentially what is 4 working days. And even in his report himself, he says, well, we've decided that best and most versatile land doesn't matter. It's a smack in the face of food security. It's a smack in the face in terms of community consent. It's a smack in the face in terms of biodiversity.
I love when they do that sort of, that cut away, and you can see these, endless green fields, lots of them just brown, presumably that's because they're growing something there. But I think we can give over a few of those to solar panels, right? If we want to have a green transition, we're going to have to put some solar panels on some of those fields, right? We can't have all of the fields that we've had before. As I always say, I think we should build on a lot of the green belt and then rewild a lot of sort of these endless fields that all look the same and have vertical agriculture when that becomes possible. Also, interestingly, on this issue, even new Green MPs are opposing green infrastructure when it's in their backyards. So Alicia Kearns there was sort of opposed to a solar farm. Green Party co-leader Adrian Ramsey is the new MP for Waveney Valley, and one of his first moves has been to oppose the building of electricity pylons that would connect offshore wind farms to the national grid. He was challenged on his opposition to that scheme on the BBC this morning.
Big issue in your constituency, pylons. You say there's a climate emergency, you say there's a need for clean energy. Why are you then saying there needs to be a pause on the building of pylons, which will bring that clean energy on land?
Well, like any other politician, I'm a constituency MP first and foremost, as well as contributing to the national debate. And when there's a planning application on any particular issue, any elected representative will work with their residents to put forward their questions, concerns about the particular proposal, and there are particular concerns about this route that is proposed through my constituency. So I'm helping residents put their views forward. Yeah. But my background is in renewable energy, and I'm the first to say we need to accelerate the rollout of renewable energy, and we need to do that in the right way.
We need to do that in the right way. Does he just mean anywhere other than his backyard, perhaps? Helena, you're a Green Party member. I want to know a couple of things from you. What did you make of Adrian Ramsey's answer there? And I suppose in general, what do you make of Labour's planning reforms?
I mean, obviously, I disagree with Adrian Ramsey's position on this. For all the StarCraft players out there, we definitely need to build some additional pylons in this country because green energy needs to get places. And in fact, the environmental concern of pylons is probably actually not as bad as it would be for having to dig up all of the grounds for underground cables that is Adrian Ramsey's preference in this case. So I absolutely disagree with his position here. It is worth saying, though, that all of the Labour and Liberal Democrat councillors in that constituency also oppose the pylon plan to go through Waveney Valley. So this is not a green specific issue. So if anybody tries to make it so that, well, the Greens are all the NIMBYs, I'm like, well, no, actually, lots of other parties also did this too. The Lib Dems are pretty bad for this as well, and so have been the Conservatives, and in some cases, Labour as well. And of course, the big problem I have with this is that in terms of electoral strategy for the Green Party, this is some short-term electoral strategy to win over certain NIMBY Tories in a couple of more rural constituencies over the fact that all of their second place finishes, I mean, literally all of their second places at the last election, or in urban constituencies, the people who need the green energy and already have to deal with lots of building in their areas. And just because some people in a couple of rural constituencies may vote green now, that is hurting their long-term electoral ambitions to win over young, climate-friendly and people who prioritise green energy policy in the urban constituencies where they're currently in second place. Well, I would say that, again, that's a problem with media focus targeting specifically the Greens rather than everybody else. As for the planning reforms more broadly, I'm a big fan. I'm a big fan of these these changes to the way in which we do planning in this country, I have been massively, massively turned against the local planning consent model over however all of the last few years of all of the NIMBY problems that we've seen across the country in these areas. And quite frankly, I'm fully Xi Jinping pilled on this. There's a reason why you can't have local planning objections to the Chinese Communist Party building high-speed rail through your area is because you can't disagree with the Chinese government on this. Like, I'm not saying that we have to start becoming a totalitarian dictatorship, but the idea that we should just have all local communities being able to completely object to policies of national importance, infrastructure of national importance. Even France does this. If it's nationally important, you cannot object to it. High-speed rail is one of those things, which is really important to be building to make our country fit for net zero. And lots of these times, really and truly, people massively object when these things are happening to them. They massively object when they want to be able to stop it. And once it happens, people tend to just forget. People tend to just forget after they've had their oppositions refused and then the thing gets built anyway. They usually don't hold grudges on these policies, and they're far more likely to care about their own material conditions rather than one piece of planning consent that they didn't have go their way. So I think broadly, this is not going to have like a long-term electoral fallout for Labour as long as they get it done quickly rather than waiting just before the next election to override all this local planning consent.
Good point, actually. I mean, it was when I was very young, but when I was, I suppose I was in primary school, but they built the M11 link road through Leighton, where I'm from. And at the time, there was huge sort of counter-mobilization against it, which I think, was probably people who were really well motivated. And I have to say, I'm not an expert on this project, so I don't want to say hands down the M11 link road was a good thing. But I did find it quite notable. My dad saying, a couple of years ago, like, really did reduce traffic in the area because what it meant is that people could, people weren't driving down Leighton High Road to try and get into central London. They'd go into via this sunken motorway. But I imagine he would have opposed it at the time. So I think you are kind of right. Often when these things get built, people are sort of like, well, actually, maybe it was kind of useful. There'll obviously be other scenarios where a situation was made loads worse by a motorway. And it is really important to say that the movement against motorways in the 1960s was really important because they were going to, concrete over loads of city centres. If you go to Bristol, it's real vandalism what they did. Just you've got this motorway that's not sunken, that just goes straight through the city centre, completely bizarre. So not all NIMBYism is bad. I think it's also worth pointing out, because I got an email about this, that obviously you do want some sort of local input in terms of where and how things are getting built. Someone emailed me sort of saying that they were infilling on the only bit of green area that people on a council estate had to play on. So I think, having input is good. I mean, a problem there, and I think this is a problem in sort of city centres, when councils do infilling, so they're trying to build more housing stock, very understandably, they can only really afford to do it on land they own. The land they tend to own is, spare room on existing estates. So infilling tends to impact people who already live in social housing. Now, obviously, maybe if we had the Chinese Communist Party, what you could do is, inconvenience a few owner-occupiers on terraced roads and say, actually, the big plan is that we're going to triple the density here. There is an inequity in the fact that the way we do it, the people it does impact tend to be in those poorer neighborhoods. But, I would say let's try and inconvenience the really rich people. And the Labour plan seems to be going to some degree in that direction. Labour's war on NIMBYs, of course, though, could create its own counter-mobilisation. This was in today's Daily Mail, so we can assume these are probably the more well-to-do NIMBYs, as Labour ploughs ahead with plans for 1.5 million new homes, even when locals object. Here's how to become a green belt super NIMBY. So they're encouraging their readers, often living near the green belt, to find out the plan, mobilize, to petition, to harness skills, not to do it alone. And this was a 3-page spread. So the next, if you turn the page, so is your town on the target list for Labour's house building boom? Be on alert if you live near an old golf course or a disused car park. And I love this because it's an implicit admission, sort of like, you need to work out a campaign to save that disused car park because you couldn't possibly have a house on a car park or an old golf course. They are definitely places where we should build houses. And they say, watch out for officials turning up with insect nets and binoculars. I think that's because of the environmental regulations when you want to build a house. And they said, don't despair. Some areas could see house prices rise by 20%. I suppose if a new town is getting built there and they have some infrastructure that they wouldn't have had before. It's not just NIMBYs that could stand in the way of proposed building projects, though. These were some really interesting comments made by Dominic Cummings at a recent talk at a London university.
A lot of people are looking at Starmer now and thinking, like, is he serious about planning reform? Is he serious about this? But what people don't really understand is that the very first thing that will happen when Starmer and Sue Gray sit around the cabinet table shortly is that a bunch of officials explain to them that, sorry, Prime Minister, but a lot of this is not just about political will. We understand that this is your priority. However, there are a whole bunch of processes around things like environmental reviews and planning stuff, which is hard-coded into primary legislation and a judicial review structure. So you're going to have planning review 1, appeal 1, judicial review, appeal of judicial review, duh. Then after that, in about 4 or 5 years, you'll have environmental review 1, appeal, judicial review, Supreme Court, duh. And if you look at some like real projects for things like building an actual road or building an actual railway now, the actual timeline for the project, like the A66, right, is like this thing for 6 years, then that thing for 6 years, then that thing for 6 years, then that thing. And then after 25 years or so, they actually start digging.
Oh, there's a change, there's an election and a new MP.
And people don't realise, like, this is so like, this is by design, and all parts of the system, lots of these things work because consultants make loads of money out of it, lawyers make loads of money out of it, Whitehall knows no other way. It's literally inconceivable, the idea of building a road in like 3 years. And it's not just a question of, so if Starmer is serious, he's going to have to come in, look at this, his head will explode, and then they'll be faced with very hard things like, okay, are you actually going to go into Parliament and use your majority to bulldoze the hybrid bill system into the earth, and then deal with all of these planning systems, the judicial review, the environmental reviews and everything else? Because if not, it will, like everything else in British politics, it'll end up just being rhetoric and it won't work. And the media's response to it will be, well, is it a political priority or not? The media never, ever, ever report all of these actual core legal constraints on the centre of government.
So I thought that was really interesting, because this is what we hear a lot about NIMBYs in the press all the time, actually. We don't hear so much about judicial reviews and the like. And, you know, I don't listen to that 2 minutes and think, okay, let's get rid of judicial review, right? Because obviously they're there for a reason. But I also think we should be able to build things more quickly. I think HS2 should have been way quicker, should have been way cheaper. We shouldn't have had to bury it to appease Tory MPs. I'm very much with you, Helena, when it comes to infrastructure. I think we should be much more like the Chinese Communist Party, or even the French, as you were saying as well. They can build infrastructure for way cheaper. But what I was thinking about this is, I don't think the answer is just deregulation, because I think the reason you have all of these judicial reviews and all of these regulations is because if you're relying on private businesses to build this stuff, the only way you can influence them is by having sort of ever more complicated contracts and sort of laws which protect the public. Whereas if you have the state who's taking a really massive active role, then you don't need so many rules, because it's just the state doing it, right? So the Chinese Communist Party, or even the French government, they don't need to sort of have all of these rules in case they were to do something really irresponsible, because we don't want them to just be profiteering. We want them to be doing something for the public good, because they won't be profiteering anyway. The whole point of them is they're the state. I mean, there might be a bit of corruption around the edges, but you're not entering into this really, really complex contractual relationship with a private company. So I think the obvious answer is we need the state to build loads more stuff so that we don't have to create these incredibly complex contracts to try and get profit-making private industries to do stuff which they shouldn't really be doing in the first place.
Oh, you're 100% correct. That was exactly my point. And the whole thing about free markets is that the only thing that matters within that transaction that can affect the way that the business acts is anything that is relevant to their profit and loss balance sheets. Of course, environmental damage has been the biggest problem that we've seen in terms of free market economics across the world. Companies don't have to factor in how polluting what they do is into their profit and loss estimates, because there's no things like carbon taxes, and you have to regulate. The only way you can get around something that it isn't part of the market transaction is through regulation. And what better way to get around that than by having a state-owned developer? Even Labour Together have floated the idea of creating GB Homes, this new private developer they could use to build housing without getting around all of the red tape that's there to stop the private sector being profligate in the way that it develops. Because, of course, environmental concerns are extremely important. They're the biggest concern in how we build things. Of course, the Conservative government were happy to rip those up when they tried to, I think there was the legislation that they were trying to push through to weaken the environmental regulations around house building, that they then used to paint the Labour Party as being NIMBYs when they opposed it, or hundreds of thousands of homes not going to get built because of that. Just have a state-owned developer, we'll be able to get around all of those problems. And it's not just in the development side as well. When it comes to things like judicial reviews and things like that, for example, and the way in which they consult over these things. Of course, Dominic Cummings mentioned there, consultancies also make money off of this. What's a way to reduce the burdensome nature of consultancy on the state? Have a state-owned consultancy. Rosie Collington, who co-wrote The Con with Mariana Mazzucato, has mentioned this very specifically, saying in Denmark, they are trying to get a state-owned consultancy. Because only would that expedite the process of going through that consultancy period. It would also make it cheaper as well. So there are plenty of ways that we can get around this when it comes to something super important like building the things that we need to have a functional society. When you can't trust the private sector to do the right thing, the interactions between the public and private sector are in no way efficient as they would once doing it. So I absolutely agree with you, 100%. Bring this all in-house. Public infrastructure for the public good, done efficiently and on time.
I want to respond to, I'm getting a little bit of pushback in the comments. So someone says, there are poor people in rural areas too, ignorant tonight. I suppose I should clarify. I don't think everyone who lives near the green belt is rich. But I think people have a sort of human right to access to nature. And so that's why I think it's really important that in cities you protect the parks and you protect the little bits of green space that people might need to play on. But even if you're poor in a rural area, then if you concrete over one field and build a housing development, there's going to be another field next to it. So while people obviously can be poor in rural areas, I don't think it's quite difficult to be sort of nature poor in a rural area by definition because you live in a rural area. So that's why I suppose I'm a bit less sort of sympathetic to NIMBYs in the countryside, because I think, well, if you used to walk your dog in that field, well, now just walk your dog in the field that's next to it. Someone else, why is Michael hating on fields so much and criticizing their appearance? They are meant for food. And I'm going to respond to that with a different comment. England is too small. There's not enough land. There's enough land for aristocracy, private estates, and grouse courses. So yeah, I think there are loads of fields that we use for stuff which isn't particularly productive. I also think we subsidize farmers often to keep their fields empty and just to grow like long grass. So I definitely think we can be food secure and build a lot more new towns, build a lot more reservoirs, build a lot more high-speed rail. I think the idea that we need to, we need to have just sort of frozen everything in the 1950s and say, well, if it's green now, it's got to be green forever, to me seems a little bit odd. Also into rewilding, right? Every time we take a field out of sort of farm use, let's make a forest in another one. Let's go on to our next story. After reading a super chat, John Matheson, pay a dividend of whole or part of the profits from the sale of new housing to the communities they are built in, and there would be no NIMBYs. I think that's a very good point. I think that would make a lot of sense. During the election campaign, Labour made a big deal about something called Great British Energy. And they made some pretty big claims about it, like this. So they said, Great British Energy will turn the page on the cost of living crisis and drive down energy bills. They said that's the choice on Thursday, the 4th of July. Vote Labour. It was, however, often unclear what Great British Energy would actually do. And that was a point which was put to Pat McFadden by Laura Kuenssberg in June.
One of the reasons it's been confusing is because representatives from the Labour Party have said different things about this from time to time. So I'll ask you again, can you be really clear? Will it be a company that will produce energy that will then be pumped into people's homes? Or will it merely, as you suggest, be an investment vehicle, essentially writing checks to encourage other companies to do the same?
It's not going to sit alongside npower or RWE or these companies. This is a different thing. This is a publicly owned company that is investing in making sure that we have the jobs of the future in these new technologies, that releases the private sector so that Britain plays a leading role in this transition.
So Pat McFadden was clear then. This wouldn't be an energy company you could sign up to, like npower or Ecotricity. So you couldn't say, well, I'm going to switch from Aon, my current provider, to GB Energy. Beyond that, though, he was pretty unclear. And in particular, it was unclear whether Great British Energy would actually own and manage electricity generating assets, so wind farms or whatever, or whether they would simply be an investment vehicle, so buying shares or subsidising other private firms. So perhaps today the King's speech could provide some clarity.
My government recognises the urgency of the global climate challenge and the new job opportunities that can come from leading the development of the technologies of the future. It is committed to a clean energy transition which will lower energy bills for consumers over time. A bill will be introduced to set up Great British Energy, a publicly owned clean power company headquartered in Scotland, which will help accelerate investment in renewable energy such as offshore wind.
So despite that being explained via King Charles's soothing and authoritative and somewhat soporific voice, I was left none the wiser after that, unfortunately. But the government's briefing notes to the King's speech, so this was sort of published alongside what he said, do spell it out a little more clearly. So first of all, the briefing explicitly describes Great British Energy as, quote, an energy production company. And it says this: the bill establishes Great British Energy, which will develop, own and operate assets, investing in partnership with the private sector. It will have a capitalisation of £8.3 billion of new money over the Parliament. Through these investments, Great British Energy will take a stake for the British people in projects and supply chains which accelerate technologies of the future, reaping benefits at home in cheap, clean power and securing Britain at the front of the global race for technology, which has major global export potential. I suppose if this is new technologies, it probably won't be solar farms. It'll probably be something that's a bit more experimental. From this quote, though, on the one hand, we have got GB Energy developing, owning and operating assets. Projects which will be, that create energy. They'll be producing energy. It also sounds like at least some of that £8.3 billion of capitalisation will be used to buy into projects and technologies operated by the private sector. And later in the notes, the government hints at this more explicitly, saying this: significant private sector investment is required to deliver a decarbonised power system, which public sector investment and institutions can stimulate through partnership. That's certainly more clear and more promising than what Pat McFadden said prior to the election. And to find out more, I'm joined now by Eleanor Shearer, a senior researcher at the think tank Commonwealth. Eleanor, what can we say about what GB Energy will actually do after today's King's speech?
I think the biggest and most important clarification we got today is Labour reaffirming the commitment for this to be about actually public ownership of energy and not just a vehicle for de-risking private investment. So during the election campaign, there were a few statements made by Labour at times that made it sound like they were scaling back the ambition of Great British Energy and making it much more about small bits of partnership with the private sector, maybe owning minority stakes in certain energy projects. But today, in the King's speech, we heard this really is about owning and managing clean power projects, and that's really welcome.
Is it not the case that it will be about both? So sort of from reading the briefing, it seems to me as if some of it will be sort of owning and operating green technology, so wind farms or whatever, and some of it will be sort of investing in potentially private companies who are sort of operating and running those pieces of infrastructure themselves.
Yeah, so I think the devil is still in the detail, in the sense of we will want to see exactly the plans for the balance of the portfolio and how much control, where there is partnership with the private sector, how much control and coordination GB Energy is able to exercise over that investment. At Commonwealth, we've always been clear that it's really important that the coordination element is in place. The point about the downsides of private investment when it comes to the energy transition is that it just can't play that essential coordinating role. So what we would say about this ultimately is it's an opening for progressives to push for the most ambitious and most strategic version of GBE possible. But I think it's still to be welcomed, because there was a certain point in the election campaign where it didn't even look like we'd have this foundation to build on.
Labour made, during the election campaign, some big claims about GB Energy. So they said it will turn the page on the cost of living crisis and drive down energy bills. The amount they're sort of committing to this, £8.3 billion, is that a large amount? Is that the kind of money that could sort of make such a difference that it will drive down people's bills?
I think there are two things missing here from Great British Energy that it would be great to see Labour build out. So the first is that £8.3 billion over the course of the Parliament is not nothing. It's a good first step, but it does need to go further to deliver that ambition, that kind of retail offer to voters. And so particularly if you look at it in the context of it's about £30 billion that's going to be needed for decarbonisation overall. So Great British Energy at the moment is only putting in less than 6% of that total. So we would want to see the capitalisation of GBE scaled up to meet the ambition that Labour has set. But the second thing I think it's important to highlight is it would be really good to see Great British Energy have a retail arm as well. In terms of that promise to voters, this is such a popular policy when it's polled. It's 75% of voters support Great British Energy. But what a lot of them are bringing to that in terms of expectation, I think, is the fact that it will actually lower their bills. And the easiest, best way to do that is to have a retail offer from GBE as well.
If they did have a retail arm, so if you could, subscribe or sign up to GB Energy in the same way that you can sign up to N-Power or whatever, that would increase the stakes a lot, right? Because obviously, presumably, it's going to be quite difficult to sort of build enough energy infrastructure that you can actually offer cheaper bills than the competitors. So I suppose they might see that as politically actually quite high risk, even if it were also potentially high reward.
I think for us, the risk is worth the reward. I mean, when we're talking about whether or not you can build sufficient, clean power for there to be an effect on people's bills, I think if we were looking at a situation where you weren't able to pass that benefit off to consumers by 2029, that would be because you are far behind meeting your ambitions for the clean power mission that Labour have already set out. So it's a kind of, at the point where you're saying, voters won't be feeling the benefits of this in terms of lower bills, that's a point where you failed quite significantly on a lot of your other decarbonisation aims. So we want to see the ambition there to meet the decarbonisation goals, but also the ambition to make sure that the benefits of meeting those goals are actually passed on to everyone in the form of lower bills.
If they were to have a retail arm, would that also make it harder to sort of co-invest with the other big energy companies? Because then they would be competitors as opposed to collaborators. I have to admit, I'm not that attuned to how our energy markets work, but I'm guessing that sort of if it became a competitor to Aon and N-Power, it couldn't then also be a sort of co-investor with those companies.
The energy system is quite complicated and the different parts of it do work together in different ways. And the point about the attraction of Great British Energy in terms of a co-investor, in terms of the power of the state, is I think it's pretty hard to replicate that power of public sector investment in other ways. So even though on the retail side it might be competing with some of these other companies, it's almost like you'd be calling their bluff to say, well, are you going to be able to do these renewable projects without that co-investment from the British state? I think empirically, in terms of the lack of investment we've seen over the last few decades, that's not been the case. So even where there might be competition at different parts of the supply chain, I think there will still be opportunities to work productively together because that public investment at the kind of energy project stage is so vital.
I want to talk about sort of Labour's approach to public ownership more generally. I know at Commonwealth, you're very much in favour of public ownership or democratic ownership. Sort of, as far as I can tell, the ledger at the moment is that Labour are renationalising the railways pretty much fully. Obviously not the rolling stock, but the rest of it. They are creating GB Energy. As far as I understand, all sort of other potential nationalisations or renationalisations they're rejecting for now. I mean, how would you characterise their approach to public ownership? Do you think they're being pragmatic? Do you think they're being ideological?
I think kind of as we were talking about earlier with Great British Energy, I describe it as the first step. I describe it as the opening for progressives to push for more. So if we take the railways as an example, really welcome that those are being brought back into public hands. It's high time that we bring an end to the failed experiment of privatisation there. In the UK, we pay about 5 times more per kilometre for our rail journeys than a country like France, which has much more public ownership in its railway system. But there's still more to do on the matter of the railways because of the rolling stock companies. So those are the companies that actually own the trains. About 87% of rolling stock in the UK is owned by just 3 companies. And those companies saw their profits rise over the past decade from about 800 million to 1 billion. So all of the same logics apply in terms of we end up paying to line the pockets of shareholders in our public system rather than being able to have all the money that we spend on the trains reinvested back in the system, in improvements, in quality, in lower prices for all of us. So that's that on the railways. And I think the other point that I'd raise, which is something that we've been talking about in Commonwealth a lot, is the water system is one of the kind of glaring omissions of public ownership here. And it's interesting to note that I alluded earlier to the fact that Great British Energy is a very popular policy with voters. In the notes to the King's speech, Labour noted that bringing railway back into public hands also very popular with voters. But if you poll the public, so many of them are also crying out for something to be done about the sewage scandal in terms of bringing these companies back into private hands, because exactly the same logic applies here. We've been paying, all of us, in terms of our bills, and that has not been seeing any of the investment in infrastructure or clean water that we were promised. And so it really is the only way to address this scandal of the companies like Thames Water that are just creaking under all this debt, is to bring it back into public ownership. So overall, I'd characterise it as a bit of a mixed approach. Labour accepting the logic of the need for public ownership in some areas, but you want to push them on the consistency of it, saying, well, if you see the logic there, why can't you see it in these other vital bits of infrastructure, vital bits of public services, and extends that logic into those areas as well.
And we've talked about it on the top of the show at length, sort of how Labour is suggesting that planning reform might sort of accelerate the green transition. What's your view of that argument and how that could play out at Commonwealth?
Planning reform clearly a piece of the puzzle, and in terms of being able to build the infrastructure in certain places. So it was really interesting to see, for example, Ed Miliband pushing ahead with plans for new major solar power projects, even in the face of some limited local opposition. I think our overall approach would be, it's really important that we do build a politics of consent for climate action, but you can't let a sort of NIMBYism overtake the need for bold, radical, fast action. We just don't have enough time when it comes to climate change to be kind of dilly-dallying on this. And so it is really important that the planning system is set up to support the rollout of this vital infrastructure all across the country.
Eleanor Shearer, thank you so much for speaking to us on Novara Live this evening.
Thank you for having me.
Now, as we've mentioned, one significant policy included in the King's speech was a commitment to renationalising the rail operators as their contracts come to an end. And the government will create a new body, Great British Railways, to manage the UK's rail network and operate renationalised train services. On the economy, we'll see a budget responsibility bill being introduced, which will essentially be laws to make sure no one can ever pull a Liz Truss against us. To say anything you do, the OBR have to rubber stamp. I'm not sure about it personally. They've also got a smoking and vaping bill, carrying out Rishi Sunak's plan to gradually ban smoking and stop the marketing of vapes to kids. That one is a little bit strange because you'll have a situation in the future where 46-year-olds will be able to buy cigarettes, but 45-year-olds won't. A little bit odd, but I suppose the public health people seem to like it. Angela Rayner's workers' rights bill was also in the speech, and Labour have promised to bring that into law in the first 100 days of Parliament. So that will give workers immediate rights to parental leave, sick pay, and protection from unfair dismissal. And it bans some zero-hour contracts, though some unions have said it doesn't go far enough. Now, nearly all of these policies were in the Labour manifesto, so they come as no surprise. However, not everything in the manifesto made it into the King's speech. So, for example, there was no mention of votes for 16-year-olds, and while hereditary peers will be kicked out of the Lords, there's still no retirement age that's been announced. There's a third group of policies that, whilst they weren't in the manifesto, the absence of them in the King's speech are still a cause of concern. So there's some things which were in the manifesto, votes for 16, which didn't make it into the King's speech, some things which were neither in the manifesto nor in the King's speech, but people are still, very justifiably, I should say, upset about them. And chief among them is the two-child benefit cap, which Labour still hasn't committed to reversing. In the House of Commons today, Starmer announced a child poverty task force instead, and that led to this exchange with SNP Westminster leader Stephen Flynn, who has tabled an amendment to the King's speech to lift the two-child cap.
Very grateful to the Prime Minister for giving way on his newly announced task force, which of course Beth Rigby was announcing on Twitter as we were all within this chamber. Mr Speaker, can the Prime Minister outline how many children will remain in poverty whilst that task force undertakes the work, which will ultimately lead to the same conclusion we are proposing, to scrap the two-child benefit cap?
Well, look, I do welcome this. I know this is an issue across the whole House. I don't think there's a single member that doesn't care about child poverty. The point of the task force is to devise a strategy, as we did last in government, to drive those numbers down. It can't be a single issue, it's across a number of strands, and we will work with people across the House in order to do it. What matters is the commitment to do it and to drive those numbers down. That is what we did last in government, and we will do it again.
Obviously, the commitment is welcome, but if you are a family who are currently in poverty because of the two-child limit, then patience might not be something you have sort of an unlimited supply of. Labour MP Kim Johnson has also tabled an amendment to the King's speech in an effort to force Starmer to lift the two-child benefit cap. She told Newsnight why.
Talk us through your direct knowledge of what's happening in terms of child poverty in the country right now.
Well, you mentioned Liam's piece that he wrote in June about austerity and poverty in Liverpool. And Liverpool Riverside is one of the most deprived constituencies in the country. 47% of children in my constituency are living in poverty. And that's 1 in 2 children. It's dire, and for me, it's heartbreaking knowing that children are going to school with empty bellies. Public sector workers are reliant on food banks. We are the 6th richest country in the world. And the fact that people are going hungry in this day and age is, from my point of view, immoral. Andrew's talked about we haven't got the money, but the likes of Gordon Brown have said, as Liam's pointed out, that lifting the two-child cap would be the quickest way of bringing 300,000 children out of poverty.
That's a good point. Well said. And this has really sort of created a really large alliance, sort of critiquing Keir Starmer for not criticizing or not committing to this. I do think the breadth of the alliance means that probably they will at some point end this cap. Maybe at the next budget, I'm not sure. Of course, they're not constrained by what is in the King's speech. So the King's speech is sort of a statement of intent, but it's not the case that, there was this bit of legislation that wasn't in the King's speech, so we can't do it. And it's also not the case that everything in the King's speech they have to do. So it's sort of saying this is what we plan, but it's not binding in any way. There are still sort of amendments because it's an opportunity to sort of spark a debate, and also tabling one of those amendments is Labour MP Zara Sultana, who wants the UK to ban arms sales to Israel, which we should have done years ago. Over the next few days, Parliament will debate the King's speech, and any of those 3 amendments might be chosen for debate in the chamber. Of course, with Labour's massive majority, it's fairly unlikely that any of those amendments would pass. And even the new leader of the opposition today sounded very conciliatory.
Now, the party opposite has successfully tapped into the public's desire for change. But they now must deliver change, and we on this side of the House will hold them accountable for delivering on the commitments that they made to the British people. In the national interest, we will not oppose for the sake of it, but when we disagree with the government, it is our responsibility as the opposition to say so. And what will guide us will be our principles: sound public finances, a belief that people know how to spend their own money better than governments do, that private enterprise, not state intervention, is the key to delivering growth and prosperity, public services that work for those who need them, an education system that gives everyone the best start in life, secure borders, and a strong national defence.
It was interesting because sort of as Rishi Sunak was sort of reading out all of those, these are the principles that will guide us, I don't think anything in the King's speech actually sort of was in opposition to those. I suppose maybe re-nationalising the railways. But I mean, Labour are pretty much saying we still want to leave most of sort of the responsibility for the British economy to private interests. I mean, I think in lots of sectors that's wrong, in lots of sectors that's reasonable. Fiscal responsibility, Rachel Reeves has exactly the same rule as the Conservative Party. So, I mean, at this point, I think it's going to be difficult for the Conservatives, because Labour's big pitch is we're doing kind of what they said they were going to do, but we're doing it more competently. So I suppose his replacement will have to work out how they are going to oppose this Labour government. I don't think many people will be really taking the Tories that seriously for a while. A Tory which no one takes seriously anymore has been somewhat less gracious in defeat. This is what Liz Truss had to say in response to Starmer's King's speech. She says, Starmer's King's speech shows Labour has no idea about the change Britain needs. Instead, it expands the power of the unelected state and increases red tape on families and businesses. The bad policies include giving more power to a failed OBR, reintroducing Stalinist housing targets rather than a zoning system, more government involvement in rail and energy, driving up costs, a conversion therapy ban which will be misused by gender ideologues, a counterproductive and unconservative smoking ban. The result of these policies will be further economic stagnation and cultural decline. Helena, lots to, I suppose, choose what you'd like to comment on there. We've got some input from Liz Truss, who's actually, I think, at the moment at the Republican National Convention. I'm not sure how many people there actually sort of recognize who she is, but anyway. Also, I suppose, any general comments on sort of what's in the King's speech that we haven't talked about so far?
I mean, with the Liz Truss statement that she's made, please, Liz Truss, keep saying how much that you think that state intervention is bad. It'll only make the public like it more, because she's so discredited as a person. The bigger platform that she gives herself to be this kind of spokesperson for conservatism only makes them look even worse. So by all means, Liz Truss, continue as you are. Although I did see someone in the replies to this saying, if you don't like all this so much, maybe get in touch with your local MP, which I thought was quite funny. But with regards to kind of the statements that were made within the King's speech, like the reaction that I got most peeved by was Rishi Sunak talking about the workers' rights legislation that's being pushed through by the Labour Party. And his point of view on this was, the reason why we have low unemployment is that we have a flexible labour market. And by flexible labour market, he means we have crappy pay and crappy terms and conditions in this country, some of the worst in Western Europe, almost certainly. And there's no evidence to show that this is the particular reason why we have such low unemployment in this country. Really and truly, we've just had a hot labour market over the course of the kind of expansionary policies that they've been doing over the course of the pandemic, which has allowed there to be a little less friction in the labour market, a little more friction in the labour market, to allow people to bargain for better wages and conditions, having had that stagnate because of a lack of expansionary policy over these periods, and of course, loads of supply-side labour market reform that has made us all poorer and has stagnated wages. So we're like £8,500 behind where we would have been if wages had been rising properly since the Conservative government took power. And to give you a really easy example of how the extra labour protections and extra terms and conditions and wages don't actually cause what he thinks would be an increase in unemployment and a drop in labour force participation rate. In Norway, for example, where they have a much higher trade union density, much better terms and conditions, and much better pay than we do here, their labour force participation rate is 10 points higher than ours is, probably because they actually fund their healthcare service. And when it comes to unemployment rate, they've had between a 3 and 4% unemployment rate for the last 15 years, whereas we've only just had this now because we've only just done expansionary policy since the pandemic happened. So that was a real kind of a fight that's going to happen over the course of this workers' rights legislation is right-wing ideologues using this as an opportunity to attack this idea of a European model of wage setting, which isn't really coming because it's been watered down so that Unite didn't back it. But this kind of discussion over the role of labour in our economy is something the Conservatives are really going to attack over the next 5 years to come. So it should be pretty interesting to see how they try to deal with it once workers realise they have much better bargaining power than they used to have.
Western media has repeatedly avoided implicating Israel in its genocidal assault on Gaza. Countless headlines have described Palestinians as merely dying, and when the word killed is used, it's rarely made clear who did the killing. It's one of the many ways that Western journalists can dehumanize Palestinians and downplay both their suffering and the brutality of Israel's onslaught. But on Tuesday, BBC News published an article with perhaps the most misleading headline we've seen so far. The lonely death of Gaza man with Down syndrome is how the article was described on Twitter. On the BBC's website, it was Gaza man with Down syndrome dies lonely death. Now, of course, that sounds like an extremely sad story from the description. You might think perhaps he died of natural causes while separated from his family, or maybe he wasn't able to get treatment for an illness. Nothing in that headline prepares you for the horrifying story that follows. The man, Mohammed Bar, was a 24-year-old Palestinian with Down syndrome who lived with his family in Gaza City. According to his mother, Nabila, he wasn't able to feed himself or change his clothes, and he found the war closing in on his family home terrifying. So Nabila told the BBC this: "We were under siege for 7 days. The tanks and soldiers were all around the house. Mohammed was staying on his sofa, and he didn't like sitting anywhere except for there. He would panic and say, 'I'm scared, scared.' He would say, 'Hey, hey,' thinking that someone wanted to hit him. He was always scared, fearful. We would come around him, comfort him. He didn't understand much." Now, according to Mohammed's family, the IDF finally raided their home on July the 3rd. Nabila reported that several dozen soldiers with a combat dog broke through into the house, smashing everything. She says she tried to tell the soldiers that Mohammed was disabled and asked them to keep the dog away from him. Instead, it attacked him. This is Nabila's description of the mauling. The dog attacked him, biting his chest and then his hand. Mohammed didn't speak, only muttering, "No, no, no." The dog bit his arm and the blood was shed. I wanted to get to him, but I couldn't. No one could get to him. And he was patting the dog's head, saying, "Enough, my dear, enough." In the end, he relaxed his hand, and the dog started tearing at him while he was bleeding. The soldiers then separated Mohammed from his family. Nabila's story goes on. They took him away, put him in a separate room and locked the door. We wanted to see what happened to him. We wanted to see Mohammed, to see what had become of him. They told us to be quiet and aimed their guns at us. They put us in a room by ourselves and Mohammed was alone in another room. They said, "We will bring a military doctor to treat him." A doctor did arrive, but Mohammed's family were still kept away from him. After several hours, the family say they were ordered by gunpoint to leave the house, leaving Mohammed behind with the soldiers. They protested, and 2 of his brothers were arrested by the Israelis. They still haven't been released. The rest of the family found shelter in a nearby bombed building, but were only able to return to the house a week later. On their return, they captured video of what they found and subsequently showed the BBC, who described it like this. Mohammed's body is lying on the floor. There is blood around him and a tourniquet on his arm. This was most probably used to stop heavy bleeding from his upper arm. Jibril points to gauze used to bandage a wound and remarks on the blood that clotted after the tourniquet was applied. Jibril is Mohammed's brother, who took the video. He told the BBC this: "They were trying to stop the bleeding. Then they left him without stitches or care, just these basic first aid measures. Of course, as you can see, Mohammed was dead for a period of time already because he was abandoned. We thought he wasn't at home, but it turned out he had been bleeding and left alone at home all this time. Of course, the army left him." Mohammed's family have no idea what happened to him between the moment they were forced to leave and their return to the house a week later. According to Middle East Eye, the family contacted the Red Crescent daily for a week, asking after Mohammed and pleading for medical treatment for him. But the Red Crescent reported non-cooperation from the Israeli military, meaning it wasn't safe for them to travel to the house. After the family found Mohammed dead, there was no post-mortem and no death certificate for the young man. The family was forced to bury him in an alley between houses because it was too dangerous to take his body to a mortuary. Mohammed's mother told the BBC this of the final moments she had with her son. "This scene I will never forget. I constantly see the dog tearing at him in his hand and the blood pouring from his hand. It is always in front of my eyes, never leaving me for a moment. We couldn't save him, neither from them nor the dog." The BBC was right. That is a lonely death. But more importantly, it was the violent and horrific killing of Mohammed by an IDF dog. And it was a death steeped in the inhumanity of Israeli treatment of Palestinians. Soldiers here left a disabled man to die of those injuries alone and presumably terrified. Now, none of that was clear from the BBC's headline, and that downplaying of the harrowing facts of the story led to an outcry on social media. Hours later, the BBC changed its headline to this: Gaza man with Down syndrome attacked by IDF dog and left to die, mother tells BBC. So that is more accurate. The question is why they didn't just start with that. Helena, this headline, I suppose the BBC will say that we've written this powerful story, but it is very much undermined by putting a sort of ridiculously misleading headline above the story.
I mean, I think we're all very used at this point to the continual usage of passive voice when it comes to the casualties in Gaza. Like, Gazans aren't killed by the IDF; they die as part of a conflict, for example. Yet the other way around, when people die in Israel, they have been killed by the Al-Qassam brigades, for example. They don't ever equivocate between these two things, and they use passive voice with regards to the actions of the Israeli military a lot of the time, and it tends to, obviously, as you've seen, publicly obscure the reality of what's happening here. Lots of people would just read the headline and not look into the article. But at least with the BBC, they actually report on some of the things that the IDF do, whereas there are plenty of media outlets in this country who will refuse to even engage in proper scrutiny of the actions of the IDF and the actions of the State of Israel because they're our geopolitical allies. Do we ever hold them to task over the inhumane treatment of people in internment camps in South Israel, people who've been taken on suspicions, for example, of being members of the Al-Qassam brigades, and the ways in which they've been treated? The Novara media have covered this quite a lot, in kind of the inhumane treatment of essentially prisoners of war in southern Israel at the time, or indeed proper reporting and proper scrutiny of the kind of crimes that we've seen in the West Bank for decades and decades. These things get covered up. There is no proper discussion of the ways in which our geopolitical allies have engaged in completely inhumane, degrading treatment of people of Palestine. We've seen, for example, IDF soldiers taking TikToks, ruffling through the underwear drawers of Palestinian women whose houses that they've been dispossessed of through the assault of the IDF in Gaza, posting having what we'd reported on previously, a sympathetic Haaretz article about IDF soldiers living in dispossessed Palestinian people's houses and eating their food as if this is just something that's normal and natural, rather than the result of a brutal military occupation. And again, this is constant throughout loads of areas of the Western press, for example, where they refuse to properly scrutinize the real kind of degrading acts of the Israeli military, because, as Oliver Dowden mentioned on Laura Kuenssberg all of those months ago, they're part of our Western family. Therefore, actual proper scrutiny that is deserved is completely whitewashed within our geopolitical interests. Otherwise, we would see what the result of ethno-nationalist ideology can lead to: people dehumanizing those they occupy.
Yeah, I mean, thinking about this as well, I mean, I think this might be an example of something, I've talked about pretty much since October the 7th, since sort of Israel began its onslaught on Gaza, which is that often within the same media organizations, you've got people who are on the ground, I mean, not in Gaza because no Western journalists are allowed in Gaza, but sort of on the ground focusing on what's actually happening. And then you've got people in London newsrooms who are a bit sort of like, oh, I don't know, it's a bit complicated. Who are we supposed to believe? The Israelis, they have these legitimate concerns, et cetera, et cetera. And so you often get really harrowing, powerful reports from people who are in Palestine. And then sort of the interpretation from someone in a London newsroom ends up being sort of a bit distorted and just bizarre. And I imagine that might be what happened here. So the really powerful article written by Virgil Keane, he's in Jerusalem, and then it might well be that sort of the headline got written by someone in London who's sort of like, oh, we shouldn't be too critical of Israel because then people will share it on social media and this is such a divisive topic. Just a hypothesis. Helena, we'll wrap up there. Thank you so much for joining me tonight.
Absolute pleasure as always to co-host with you, Michael. Thank you very much.
And thank you everyone for watching this evening. Come back tomorrow for another live stream from 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.